Hey everyone, back again with another video. So this video is going to mainly talk about the new tournament rules that Konami just basically dropped on us, and since these rules are going to have more of a everlasting effect on Yu-Gi-Oh for the foreseeable future, I thought it was worth talking about these rules since we're kind of in a crazy situation with the pandemic, and it looks like they're going to host events still. So this is probably important to know if you plan to attend events such as Konami sanctioned tournaments. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So the first of the big changes to come out of this, I guess, new Yu-Gi-Oh Tournament rules is that you can now use Yugioh Neuron, which is a phone app that Konami developed. And if you don't know what Yugioh Neuron is, I'll give you a bit of a rundown of what it does. So if you don't know, Yugioh Neuron is a phone app that basically acts as a calculator. You can also keep track of your life points since it gives you a life point log that you can see throughout the game to see how you got to the specific life point total. And it's convenient since you primarily track your life points in a tournament game with a pencil and paper. However, you still must keep track of your life point total on a sheet of paper in the event that the app malfunctions or something happens to your phone where it runs out of battery or it just dies for whatever reason. And it's also great because you couldn't use your phone in the past to keep track of your life points, but now you can, and you can have a digital record of it with Yugioh Neuron. So if you guys use any other apps like Cyrus, it's kind of like a fancier version of that and can do much more. Because furthermore, Neuron also doubles as a digital dice and coin flipper whenever you need to use a card effect that involves a coin or die. This is significant since it means you don't potentially risk touching your opponent's coins or dice, which helps keep people safe, especially since we're in the midst of this pandemic. And it's also convenient since you don't have to bring dice or coins to the tournament because of this feature, and how Yugioh Neuron basically frees up space so you can carry more things, so you're not carrying die or coins. It also allows you to keep track of which cards resolve their effects first by allowing you to use digital counters as a placeholder to remind you of which cards are resolved. So you can't really use this in official tournaments, but it's better used in casual play if you want to. However, as an added bonus, it functions as a deck builder, much like Yugipedia does. However, its advantage is that it allows you to use your camera to take pictures of your physical cards and allows you to port those cards into your deck on Neuron. However, it functions as a mini Yu-Gi-Oh card database, which you can use to search up cards to add to your digital deck, and it also acts as a translator, which can help you look up cards and effects if your opponent's using cards printed in a different language. And it's also useful since you can look up the official errata, which eliminates some confusion as to whether you or your opponent is using the appropriate errata. So this is really helpful if you can't read a card, especially if it's in a different language. You can use the camera feature and basically take a picture and figure out what the card effect is right there on the spot. So that's really useful. And you can take advantage of most of these features in tournaments, along with being able to register your deck digitally, which does save time by not having to go physically register your deck at the venue. Though you still have to print out a physical list of all the cards in your deck. However, Neuron does allow you to create a JPEG of the deck list which you're using, which you can then print out and present it at the venue. Keep in mind, you can't send a digital copy of the list to the venue, but you can email that list to yourself, which you can then print out. However, you will need to gain access to a printer yourself if you do decide to print the list. You can't edit this JPEG file, and registering your deck through Neuron will not fill out all of the required tournament info. So although we can't use all of Yugioh Neuron's features in a tournament setting, it does provide us with the most powerful tool of allowing us to translate Yu-Gi-Oh card effects from different languages, and it does allow us to figure out basically the long dispute of knowing which errata you have at the given moment, and whether if it's the official errata. So that's something to really keep in mind. So these next rules aren't rules that directly affect the game, but they're more intended for the health and safety of the people playing the game. So the first rule concerns wearing proper attire, being that Konami updated their rules about wearing masks, and they've modified this rule to fit the health and safety requirements of different areas, which is still kind of vague, but I'm glad that they're taking active measures to ensure the health and safety of the player base at these tournaments. It's like the expansion of the shower rules, because now Konami requires you to wear clean or washed clothes and maintain a proper hygiene to where people basically don't smell. So what they're basically saying here is take a shower. And God, I hope people take a shower, because the smell is really unpleasant, to be honest, which they kind of mentioned in their official rules. But I hope people do exercise proper hygiene and shower often, especially because of this pandemic. Furthermore, Konami also mentions wearing appropriate clothes that aren't offensive or provocative in any way, which that's very basic, and that's kind of been the way for a long time. But I wanted to include this section in general, since it seems like Konami is going to plan to adhere to some kind of mask wearing rules at particular events in different regions. So be sure to be familiar with those rules just for your safety alone, and also to not get kicked out of the tournament venue if that pretty much concerns you, which probably does. So something I found interesting was the change in rules in terms of loops. So loops are typically broken down into control loops and infinite loops. Control loops kind of inherently explain themselves, where it's a loop that you can control by choosing to activate an effect that triggers other effects, which ultimately have a resolution. And the way you normally approach control loops is by letting your opponent know how many times you intend to use the loop. However, more controversial loops are infinite loops, where we mainly dealt with them by determining whether or not they had a resolution, or more specifically, if they eventually result in a game win or loss. Loops that didn't result in some sort of resolution, game win or loss, would be considered illegal moves, and you couldn't really perform them. This led to many cards getting banned in the past, since they would create loops with no resolution, or create a situation that was such a rolling nightmare that would contradict other legal effects. And that's ultimately why they got banned, so that scenarios like this could be avoided. Though some loops weren't bad and could be fixed with simple rulings, and others could really receive erratas, but some would create such muddy situations where cards had to be banned. But now with this new change, the loop rules can be decided by a judge, where a judge can be called to determine whether the loop has a resolution, and if it doesn't, the judge can declare that card must be sent to the graveyard so that the game can continue to be played. So I actually kind of like this, because it allows more cards to be actually playable and not just sit there in the ban list and kind of just wither away and be forgotten to time. So I really think Konami did a good job on this, since we can kind of incorporate more cards that we kind of lost to the past, and we can kind of reintroduce into the game. So that's a positive. And furthermore, this helps solve current loops that are going on in the format right now, such as the pole position loop. If you don't know what that loop is, I'll put up the pole position card effect on the screen, along with the example that they also use in the rules, so just so you guys can familiarize yourself with that. So that's something to consider. So one of the more annoying changes to the rules is the change to the way you can keep track of the amount of counters you have on a card. This change can be found underneath the material section of the new cards, where it says counters. And the change is primarily annoying because a lot of players, from my experience, are used to using the dice to keep track of the amount of counters they have on a card. More specifically, a lot of people I've played against use the dots on the dice to tell how many counters they have on a particular card. For example, 6 dots means 6 counters on that specific card. But now you can't use the dots on the dice to quantify the amount of counters you have on a card, according to the new official rules. You must instead use 4 individual dice to signify you have 4 counters on a card if you're trying to put 4 counters, instead of using the dots as you normally would. As annoying as this is, I do see why Konami made this new rule, since dice have a tendency to roll around and you may accidentally knock the die that was sitting on top of one of your cards, and you may lose track of how many counters you actually had on the card. And this gets really complicated when you use decks like Endymion, or if you're using a Royal Magical Library Exodia deck for whatever reason. And it's absolutely crucial for you to keep an accurate track of the amount of counters you have in these decks. However, this is inconvenient for the decks I just mentioned, since they tend to accrue tons of counters on multiple cards, and it really can take up space on the card or on the field in general. Though you can use plastic beads or ideally spare change, since you can stack them on top of each other to indicate the amount of counters you have. So those may be a few, I guess, tips that you can use to kind of mitigate the inconvenience of having to physically put individual counters instead of using the dots on the dice to make it a little more, I guess, easy in general. So before we get into the next big change of the rules, I want to talk about the changes made to the note-taking system during tournament games. You obviously can and must use notes to keep track of your life points, and you may use them to keep track of your opponent's life points, but you can also take notes to keep track of the following, which includes mandatory effect reminders, tracking turns, along with turn counters, and you can also take notes to keep track of effects or actions that are required to keep a legal game state. However, written notes are the only acceptable form of notes that are allowed, and you ironically can't use Yugioh Neuron's note-taking feature to keep track of notes, and you can't use other things such as dice or other counters as a form of note-taking by extension. The rules also emphasize that notes must be taken quickly, and it doesn't deter from the fluidity of the game, and so it doesn't waste time in contrast with everything else. So, if note-taking does interrupt the flow of the game, or the duel in general, the appropriate penalties may be applied to the given player, which can include penalties such as slow play, and it looks like note-taking in tournaments may be intended to keep record of things, or just necessary things or actions which can help the quality of the game, instead of just keeping track of pretty much anything you want. So this includes keeping track of penalty effects, like using Allure of Darkness, which you can take note to the part where you banish a dark monster or you send your entire hand to the grave as the penalty effect, because it's mandatory. So those are one of the things that you can use to keep track of in notes. So I found that to be really interesting and kind of useful for some people who want to be more organized in these type of games. So the next huge rule drop involves double sleeving at tournaments. And this is huge because double sleeving is something that hasn't been allowed in TCG tournaments, but it's been something that fans have been asking for the longest time, especially since Magic the Gathering, and the OCG they've had double sleeving for the longest time. And being that Yu-Gi-Oh events have experienced unusual amounts of cheating in the past, I think that's the primary reason why Konami has kept double sleeving banned from the TCG, especially since a few crafty individuals might try to pull a Bandit Keith and put more than one card in a double sleeve, which the new rules specify that only one card must be used when you partake in double sleeving, and you must have nothing else but that one card in that double sleeve. Though Konami has set rules where all sleeves in the main deck must be identical in color, wear, and design, and the sleeves can be different when you're using them in the extra deck. So all sleeves must be sleeved in the same direction and manner. That's one of the new stipulations they put into these rules. And sleeves with mirror-like properties or very reflective backgrounds or holographic fonts designs, or artwork on the front that obscure the text or illustrations are not allowed in tournaments. That's all, those particular descriptions cannot be found on these double sleeves. However, sleeves with artwork on the back, as long as they are identical and non-offensive in nature, are allowed. So keep in mind that the previous info is subject to the judge's interpretation. So that's something to keep in mind and kind of think about when you do double sleeving. Furthermore, the double sleeve must be clear and may have a brand, watermark, or artwork that doesn't interfere with the card's readability, though the second sleeve must not have a holographic front. And you must also double sleeve in the opposite direction of the first sleeve so that the card is sealed in between both sleeves. So double sleeving is great because it provides greater protection to your cards, especially since the top of the card of the single sleeve is still exposed. And I've experienced this since I've noticed that the top of my single sleeved cards kind of brown a little at the top, or small bits of dust eventually find their way into this opening, which may damage the card in turn. And the addition of the double sleeve also efficiently protects against any water damage or just hazards in general that may involve water and may be present in your immediate area. So double sleeves also make using official Konami sleeves more viable, since Konami sleeves seem to easily fall apart, especially when being shuffled. However, the double sleeve acts as a barrier that prevents the wear and tear on these less durable Konami sleeves, and I've personally seen this issue at play, especially when I duel against my friend. He's had this issue, and I've seen this when he bought and used the flashy new Kaiba Corp sleeves, and it didn't take long for the shuffling motion of the cards to start producing nicks at the start of the card and more at the top of the card really, and peeling the holographic back off of the card or peeling the sleeve even in half. So although double sleeving might have been forbidden for the most of the TCG's history, it's great to see that we now can better protect our cards a lot more effectively, and this may give a lot more longevity to very prized cards that maybe are just expensive in general or hold more value, especially for us, maybe because they're special to us. So that's what I found to be great in this entire situation. So yeah, that pretty much wraps it up for this video, and I really want to make this video because this was really the biggest piece of Yu-Gi-Oh news to come out in a long time. I mean, this is probably going to be the most impactful news that pretty much determines how we're going to play for pretty much the rest of this pandemic, and it's interesting to see how Konami is trying to tiptoe around the effects of this pandemic in order to put Yu-Gi-Oh tournament events back in full flow, or somewhat like full flow, as opposed to before the pandemic. But yeah, it was interesting to see all of this, and if you would like to support more content like this, you can do so at my Patreon. I normally link it down below in the description. You can find it down there along with the other cool things I normally post down below. And with that, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, take care.